Good morning and welcome to this special news programme marking the death of Martin McGuinness, former Deputy First Minister of the Stormont Executive and leader of Sinn Féin in the North. Mr McGuinness, who was 66, passed away this morning after a short illness. He resigned from the Executive earlier this year, triggering an election in which he did not stand due to his failing health. Mr McGuinness is survived by his wife Bernie and 4 children. There have been many tributes to the former IRA commander, who was later Sinn Féin's chief negotiator in the talks that led to the Good Friday Agreement, and subsequently joined the power-sharing government as Minister for Education and later Deputy First Minister. Let's go straight to Stormont now and talk to our Northern editor, Tommy Gorman, who joins us. Tommy, news of Martin McGuinness's illness, it seems very recent, just over Christmas and the New Year, and this morning the news that he has passed away.
That's right, Brian. Very hard to believe, really, that he was so healthy and so full of energy up to a short time ago. I was just thinking that it was on the steps behind me, these very steps here in May 2007, that the late Ian Paisley, Tony Blair, Bertie Ahern and Martin McGuinness came down to formally, I suppose, in a way, baptise the beginning of power sharing. That was 10 years ago. In recent times, he had health issues, and it came upon him very suddenly. Martin McGuinness, he didn't smoke, rarely drank, he was very, very fit, he loved to exercise. Nothing pleased him more than when he'd get home late in the evenings to Derry to go across the border to Greenon and Alloch in County Donegal, and to go with Bernie and their dog, and to do that strenuous walk to the top of Greenon and Alloch. As late as November, Brian, I remember there was one weekend where Martin McGuinness went to New York, he went to San Francisco, and on the Monday he was at that function in London in Crosby Hall where the portrait of Queen Elizabeth was unveiled. That was November. Then it was in late November, the beginning of December, that he began to complain of breathlessness. He went to see his GP, he was referred to specialists, and he was diagnosed with a rare heart condition called amyloidosis. But even then, the prognosis seemed to suggest that he would have a chronic condition, but that he would have several years of healthy life. I spoke about it to him in detail. We talked about health issues because I had my own experience of dealing with a chronic condition. And he genuinely believed, and I genuinely believed, he was going to get better. And then it was in January that he began to receive treatment. He went to London where his condition was benchmarked. He received some care in Belfast in the Royal Victoria Hospital, and then he began a course of chemotherapy in Altnagelvin Hospital. And that was as an outpatient in the beginning, and he spoke about the kindliness and the professionalism of the staff there. And then 5-6 weeks ago, his condition began to worsen. He was admitted to hospital. He was in intensive care. His family were with him all the time. And sadly, he lost his battle, I think, between 2 and 3 o'clock this morning in Altnagelvin Hospital with his wife, Bernie, and other family members at his bedside.
Tommy, his was a long and remarkable career, and we'll look at it a little more fully in a moment. But just in relation to the recent period, there's no question he was a key figure in Sinn Féin in the power-sharing arrangements there at Stormont in the last number of years.
Brian, the political relationship between Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness was like no other. Their background was so different. They had both been senior figures in the IRA for God knows how long, maybe up until recent times. But they also led the IRA towards the political road, and then they went exclusively down that path. And the remarkable thing about the relationship was you never saw any sign of a disagreement between them in public or in private. They were that close. But Martin McGuinness was certainly seen as the warmer of the personalities. In the case of Martin McGuinness, he might have a falling out with you, but if there was any hint of a gesture of reconciliation to Martin McGuinness, well then, like a light switch, he changed. He really was a warm personality who got on with even his foes, and I think that was one of his strengths. I saw him operating in all sorts of company. Personally, I think the highest point of the peace process, the highest, most public point, was probably in those months immediately after devolution. I remember there was a trip to the United States where they rang the bell on the New York Stock Exchange, where they attended a function in the home of the then Irish consul, Niall Burgess, now Secretary General in the Department of Foreign Affairs. And you had going to functions at that time in New York. You had the likes of Liam Neeson, Loretta Brennan-Glucksmann from the Ireland Fund. You had Bill Flynn, one of the great figures of Irish America. And Paisley, McGuinness, the two Paisleys, because Junior Paisley, Ian Paisley Jr. was on that trip as well. They were in their element, and you saw the little touches, you saw the warmth of Martin McGuinness in those exchanges. I remember at one stage Ian Paisley was walking up a long stairs, and towards the end he began to struggle, and Martin McGuinness went and got a chair and placed it at the top, and then he came down and he slipped his arm around Ian Paisley and brought him to the top of it. And in recent times that relationship has continued with the Paisley family. This wouldn't be widely known, but throughout Martin McGuinness's illness, Eileen Paisley, the wife of Ian Paisley, was in constant touch with him until his phone was actually taken from him in Atnagelvin Hospital to allow him to sleep. She was in daily contact with him, and that was the kind of bond he formed with the foe. And I think that epitomised the role of Martin McGuinness, the peacemaker. He embraced it. It wasn't an each way bet with him. He was totally committed to it, and I think that's what he will be remembered for ultimately.
Tommy, thanks for that moment. You will be staying with us and we will be returning to you in the course of this programme. But as we've been saying, Martin McGuinness was Sinn Féin's chief negotiator in those talks that led to the Good Friday Agreement, ending years of violence. He led the party into power sharing with the DUP in 2007.
From provisional IRA commander to political peacemaker, Martin McGuinness's journey took him from the Bogside into peace negotiations and on to Windsor Castle. He grew up in a Derry where there were more Catholics than Protestants, but Unionists had control. In the Bogside, Catholics were poor and oppressed. Civil rights marches turned into riots, and the British Army was deployed on the streets. Martin McGuinness joined the IRA, believing armed struggle was the only way to achieve a free Derry.
When he was active on the streets of Derry, he was to be seen. You know, he wasn't a mysterious, invisible figure manipulating others. It was quite visible.
He quickly rose through the ranks of the Provisional IRA as their campaign of violence targeted Unionists and Catholics who didn't toe the line.
People being shot, people being tarred and feathered, people being driven out of their homes, all of that. So it grew from perhaps an innocent, exciting uprising to something that went very, very vicious.
Now, as the officer commanding the Derry part of the IRA provisional operation, can you say whether the bombing is likely to stop in the near future in response to any public demand?
Well, we will always take into considerations the feelings of the people of Derry, and these feelings will be passed on to our GHQ in Dublin, you know.
Bloody Sunday resulted in the deaths of 14 men and boys, which bolstered support for the IRA and Martin McGuinness. Convicted of IRA membership and sentenced to 6 months, when he came out he became a familiar face beside Gerry Adams, and spurred on by the electoral success of the hunger strikers, Republicans decided to run for election. Now a politician, he remained a prominent Republican, and terrible things continued to happen in Derry. A census collector, 29-year-old Joanne Mathers, was shot dead collecting forms. Republicans had urged people not to fill them out. Frank Hegarty, a member of the IRA turned informer, was shot dead after being promised safe passage home to Donegal. And Patsy Gillespie, a Catholic, was strapped into a van loaded with explosives, which exploded at a checkpoint, killing himself and 5 soldiers. As the countless deaths continued, the IRA began to realise that they weren't going to end this by military means. A ceasefire was announced and Sinn Féin began negotiations, eventually resulting in the Good Friday Agreement.
Had he not come from that place, he would not have been able to bring other people with him on that journey. That must not be forgotten.
But Martin McGuinness had a tough battle persuading Republicans to decommission weapons and support policing and the rule of law, and the negotiators knew it.
At one point it got so heated that both Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness cornered me in a cupboard in Hillsborough Castle and really tried to threaten me. And tried to threaten me that I would get sacked by Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, from my job. I knew that was nonsense.
And the real breakthrough for power sharing came when Reverend Ian Paisley finally agreed to sit down with Sinn Féin.
If we could do a deal with Martin McGuinness and we could work with Martin McGuinness, we could then work with any Republican because he was the authentic voice of that movement.
Once bitter enemies, Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness created a devolved government, representing their sides as equals. A partnership, even friendship developed, and they were dubbed the Chuckle Brothers.
They had very personal talks, and it wasn't about being cosy with each other. It was about respecting each other.
For Martin McGuinness, the shift had happened. He was now a statesman. He even ran, albeit unsuccessfully, to be President of Ireland. So it seemed the time had come to make perhaps his most significant peacetime gesture.
I was there when the Queen of England walked in, and it was a different relationship, and I think I always got the impression she was as happy to meet Martin McGuinness as he was, and they met a number of good few times after that, and I think that changed the position.
I'm still a Republican.
Martin, how was it to meet the Queen?
Very nice.
Power sharing had its ups and downs, but as Sinn Féin's partners in government changed, Martin McGuinness was the one constant, the longest serving minister in the executive. Collapsing power sharing over the cash for ash controversy was his last big political decision. But it was a much frailer Martin McGuinness who returned to the bogside that night as illness forced his retirement.
I'll always be very proud to be from the bogside. I've ended up in many famous places throughout the world, but my heart lies in the bogside and with the people of Derry. Mila
Martin McGuinness is survived by his wife Bernie and 4 children.
Well, the DUP leader Arlene Foster has also expressed her sympathy to the family of Martin McGuinness. She said she wanted to acknowledge his contribution to the governance of Northern Ireland, but also to recognise that this was a difficult day for many victims.
I do want to send my sincere sympathy to his family, a family who he was tremendously proud of and talked about a lot, to his wife, to his children, and indeed to his grandchildren, who again he was incredibly proud of. I know this is a hugely difficult day for many across Northern Ireland, difficult for many different reasons, and indeed there are many victims today who are feeling very hurt and very sore, and I would never seek to minimise that pain that they're going through today. History will judge all of that. For my part, I served in the government of Northern Ireland with Martin McGuinness for 10 years. In fact, I was just thinking this morning that he and I were the last two to have served continuously from 2007 up until dissolution just in January of this year. So he did, I have to say, I want to acknowledge his contribution to the governance of Northern Ireland here over those 10 years, and I think it is important that that is reflected and that everything is balanced today.
Well, let's go now on the line to the former Northern Ireland Secretary, Peter Mandelson, who joins us. Lord Mandelson, thanks very much indeed for taking our call. You were Northern Ireland Secretary at Stormont at a period, I think it was in the late 1990s, the early stages of devolution, power sharing. How significant a figure at that stage was Martin McGuinness?
Well, he was a very significant figure indeed, because if you remember at that time, the Good Friday Agreement had been negotiated and signed in 1998, but during the course of the following year, it became stillborn. It ran into the sand. We couldn't actually implement it, and that's when I came onto the scene. And, you know, famously, I had a rather fiery relationship with Martin McGuinness. I mean, I came at a time when he and Gerry Adams and their other colleagues had got used to dealing with Mo Molum and rather liked it. And they found me, a rather different kettle of fish. But what I was able to do, and I must say they adjusted very pragmatically and quickly to this, what I think I was able to do and to bring to the table was an ability to get the unionists to give implementation of the Good Friday Agreement a chance if the IRA would actually start decommissioning their weapons. And that, of course, we know became a very, very bumpy ride indeed, but we got there in the end.
Ian Paisley Jr. has been commenting that the significance of Martin McGuinness, as he characterises, was that when you were speaking to him, you were listening to the authentic voice of the Republican movement. Was that how you approached your dealings with Martin McGuinness, that you were dealing here with someone who would speak for the Republican movement in both its military and political guises, I suppose?
Yes, it was, and that was the importance of him. That he was able not simply to talk to a political audience and to make a political argument, but to talk to those, on the IRA side of the Republican movement, the provisional IRA, amongst whom he was a very senior leader, and to persuade them not just to put down their guns, but to reject them forever and to start decommissioning them. If he hadn't been in that position, and hadn't been able to direct his powers of argument to those people, then he would have made a lesser contribution to the peace process, and I suspect we wouldn't be where we are today.
What about his personal qualities? Many, I think, have commented on the fact that he was someone who engaged in a very human way with people across the political spectrum, and it seemed was able to win their respect and their friendship. Is that something you observed?
Yes, it is. Look, above all, what he did, and this was absolutely indispensable to the peace process. It was the seed corn of the peace process. He helped build up trust amongst people. He was a difficult person to negotiate with. I make no attempt to disguise that. David Trimble, I see, has talked about Martin's even-tempered manner. Well, he could be even-tempered. He could also be very bloody. I might say to you, he could be quite brutal. But when he said he would do something, and when he said he'd reached a position, along with Jerry and others as well, then you could rely on that. And that was what was important, that, at the end of the day, when he accepted that something needed to be done, it may not be easy to achieve it, and it may take more time than we had wished, but at the end of the day, he would do it. And that was what made the peace process possible.
All right, there we leave it. Peter Mandelson, former Northern Ireland Secretary, thank you indeed for taking our call. We'll take a short break now and return with a little more in a few minutes. Hello again, you're watching this special news broadcast marking the death of Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin. The former British Prime Minister Tony Blair has said that when Mr McGuinness came to his view that peace was the right way forward, he pursued it with a lot of skill and a lot of leadership.
For people like myself talking about Martin's contribution to peace, there will be people who remember the earlier days, those particularly who lost loved ones in the Troubles, and they will find it very hard to forgive and impossible to forget. So, we should always be aware of that. In a strange way, though, the steel that he showed back then in the pursuit of armed struggle was also a steel and a degree of dedication and commitment that was very ruthless. But that same determination was then brought forward in the peace process. So the character of Martin McGuinness, in one sense, did not change. That steel was always there, but once he decided to deploy it in pursuit of peace, he did so with a lot of courage and a lot of leadership.
Well, now, in the last little while, the former Ulster Unionist leader and former First Minister David Trimble, who led that first parish area executive, has released a letter which he wrote to Martin McGuinness just in the last week or so, saying that he was surprised to learn of his illness and of its seriousness. But he said that he wanted to say how much he appreciated all that he did in helping to make the Good Friday Agreement come about in 1998. He said, and I'm quoting, in doing that, you reached out to the unionist community in a way some of them were reluctant to reach out for you. David Trimble says, without knowing the detail of how the Republican movement moved to that point, I and my colleagues, he says, believed that you, Martin McGuinness, McGuinness were indispensable. That release now by David Trimble just in the last little while. We're joined by our correspondent David Davenport, who reported from Northern Ireland during the whole period leading up to and after the Good Friday Agreement. David, that's a remarkable tribute from David Trimble to Martin McGuinness in what turned out to be the final week of his life.
I remember that period when Martin McGuinness was, as David Trimble said there, indispensable. This was before he was Deputy First Minister, before he was Chief Negotiator, before he was Minister for Education. He was trying to persuade the IRA that a ceasefire was in their best interests. And these were very, very, very tense times. I vividly remember a Sinn Féin conference in Donegal in Letterkenny that rejected the notion of the Good Friday Agreement. Everything seemed lost. We didn't know then that in the background there were very serious moves afoot that led to the establishment effectively of the real IRA, with significant IRA figures splitting from the movement. Martin McGuinness was absolutely central to all those manoeuvrings to try and keep the Republican movement as united as possible, to deliver the 1994 ceasefire, which led to so much. And these were times when he wasn't being chauffeur-driven in a ministerial car. One could imagine there were trips in blacked-out vans and certainly lots of counter-surveillance techniques being employed. This was tough stuff. Because when you think about it, we remember the Chuckle brothers, we remember the close relationship in recent years between Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. But back in those days, Martin McGuinness was the hard man. He was the man that spoke to the IRA. He was the man who, as Peter Mandelson said there, if you got a deal from him, you knew the deal would stick, but it could be pretty bloody again, as Mr. Mandelson said, in the hammering out of that deal. He was a tough cookie. And that, in a sense, was the yin and yang between himself and Gerry Adams that brought the Republican movement along that road. Here you had Adams, a theorist, perhaps a little colder than Martin McGuinness. You had Gerry Adams from Belfast, a spikier town than Derry in every sense. But they melded together, and they were a formidable duo right down through that period, leading to the secret contacts that preceded the IRA ceasefire, in which Martin McGuinness was so central, liaising with the retired MI6 man Michael Oakley, leading up to that period where, as I say, he tried might and main and ultimately succeeded to get the vast bulk of the IRA to go along with the ceasefire. And then the whole decommissioning saga that really blighted the first years of devolution. He was at the coalface there as well. So, as Alan McBride, who suffered so much in the Shankill bomb, said this morning, he said, Martin McGuinness's fingerprints, they're all over the Troubles, he said, but they're all over the peace process as well.
And that, I suppose, underlines an aspect of this, that there's a great deal we know about Martin McGuinness's career, but there's a great deal we don't know, and perhaps it has yet to be written, if indeed will ever be written.
Well, we may never know, as Tommy Gorman was saying earlier this morning. The IRA is a secret organisation. It was remarkable, mind you, to see a young Martin McGuinness being interviewed on the streets of Derry by the BBC, I think it was, and being asked, when is the bombing going to stop? I mean, it spoke of a completely different era, both in terms of the media and street politics. But then there was the period where we don't know what Martin McGuinness was doing. We know he was senior in the IRA. In that, of course, there's a distinction between him and Gerry Adams, who still denies he was ever in the IRA. But there's no doubting that rank-and-file Republicans, to use that, what you might call a euphemism, they looked up to Martin McGuinness, and they would certainly have followed him anywhere.
All right, stay with us, David, because Alistair Campbell, who was Tony Blair's former Director of Communications, has said he found Martin McGuinness very warm, human and likeable, but he understands that many others will not remember the former Deputy First Minister in that way.
I think if you're Norman Tebbit and you were there when the IRA bomb ripped through the Grand Hotel and it left your wife in a wheelchair for the rest of her life, I can see it would be very, very hard. I didn't know Martin McGuinness, the terrorist. I knew Martin McGuinness, the guy who came into Downing Street and led the Sinn Féin negotiating team that took us to a very, very different place. And along the way, I saw somebody who was very warm, very human, and very likeable. And I just speak as I find. I think his legacy actually depends on what happens now, because I know this from having talked to him. He was really, really worried about the implications of Brexit on the peace process. And if the peace process falls apart, and if we actually do go back to the sorts of troubles that that we grew up with and that our generation remembers vividly, then the legacy clearly becomes weakened. So I think actually this is a day, I think, to reflect on the progress that's been made and make sure we do not do the things that push it back into a very, very dangerous scenario.
David, just a final word with you. I mean, we saw, if you like, at a senior level, very good relations between unionists and Martin McGuinness with Ian Paisley, and again this letter which I've quoted to you from David Trimble. But perhaps from very many ordinary unionists, members of the Protestant community in Northern Ireland, there'd be some more mixed feeling today. Would it be fair to say?
Well, look at the current political context. You mightn't think much of the devolved administration, but it's not there now, and there's a political vacuum, and there's certainly an edginess among the elected representatives reacting to the passing of Martin McGuinness. You saw that reflected in what Arlene Foster had to say. I thought David Trimble, speaking from a historical perspective perhaps, was markedly more generous in a more unstinting way than Arlene Foster was. But that, I think, is because Northern Ireland is not in a great place at the moment. I would have thought that ordinary unionists who have had time to reflect on what's happened over the last 10, 15 years recognise that Martin McGuinness overall was a force for good. I think it was Ian Paisley Jr. who said this morning, it's not really where you start in life, it's where you end up. And I think by any yardstick, Martin McGuinness ended up in a good place.
Okay, David, there we'll take a break. Back with more reaction to the passing of Martin McGuinness in just a couple of minutes. And again, you're watching this special news programme marking the passing of the former Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin. Former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern has said today that Mr McGuinness was a critical part of changing the course of history toward the path of peace in Northern Ireland. He described him as a skilled negotiator and spoke of the relationship he developed with First Minister Ian Paisley.
Dr Paisley said to me several times that he totally accepted that he had moved and transitioned in his life from where Martin had been involved in the IRA and involved in the military campaign of the Provisional IRA, and then had turned into being a peacemaker and a politician. And Dr Paisley accepted that, and the two of them worked very closely together. And apart from what we saw on the TV with the laughs and the jokes, but they genuinely took to working on the early years of trying to build up the new executive and the new assembly in the north. And I think that was one of the really interesting things of the whole peace process. From polar opposite positions, they work so closely together.
Former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, the Minister of Foreign Affairs Charlie Flanagan, has also sympathised on the death of Mr McGuinness and acknowledged the political journey that he made.
Martin McGuinness will be remembered for the mixed individual that he was, going back a long number of years as a teenager, involved in militant republicanism in Derry, to becoming a leader of a Republican organisation that didn't always support normal democratic structures and institutions. But I think in particular, the long and lasting and indeed leading contribution that Martin McGuinness made to peace must be acknowledged. It wasn't an easy transition in Northern Ireland to move from a society scarred in the heat of conflict to a society with what we might describe as normal political institutions. That journey wasn't easy. Martin McGuinness was a leading proponent of the path towards stability and peace and reconciliation. It's not yet concluded. It's not yet complete. And I hope the legacy of Martin McGuinness will be an enduring one of the journey on the path and avenue towards peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland and across the island of Ireland.
Charlie Flanagan speaking at Leinster House a little while ago. Well, let's go back to Stormont, where Tommy Gorman is still standing by for us. Tommy, I see former President Mary McAleese has been speaking this morning. She said that she understood how strong and irresistible the path to violence would have been for a young man like Martin McGuinness back in Derry in the late 1960s, and applauded him, she said, for changing direction. She says it says something about the leadership qualities that he brought to bear, that he was able to bring the IRA on board with him. That's very much a theme of those who are talking about him today, that he's somebody, and not only who made a personal journey from violence to exclusively peaceful political means, but also brought the Republican movement, or much of it, with him.
Yes, I think it's also a recognition of how different people behave in different ways when faced with a set of circumstances. At the time that Martin McGuinness joined the IRA, he was very young. In terms of discrimination, it was a very black and white situation. But when he did embrace peacemaking, when he did believe that there was a better way, he embraced that totally. I'll tell you a small story, Brian, and maybe it's instructive in a way. About 5-6 months ago, we were standing on a hill overlooking the Bogside late at night, and I was preparing to interview Martin McGuinness for a piece that was going live into our 9 o'clock bulletin. And a number of people, dissident supporters, came and fired eggs at us. Now, I was going live into the 9 o'clock news, and I must say that my temper was very short on that night. But the reaction of Martin McGuinness in that situation was completely different. He was very, very calm. He almost shook his head wistfully, and I think he remembered how at a different time in his life he might have reacted very differently. And I think what people have been recognising right through, say, the kind of statements that have come from the likes of Nigel Dodds, the deputy leader of the DUP, from Arlene Foster herself, from Theresa May, a Tory Prime Minister, somebody who had no involvement in the peace process. That was on the watch of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and I suppose with an input from John Major before that. But there has been a generosity in the statements that they have made, and I think crucially there has been a recognition that while many people had an IRA passed, it would be very hard to find somebody who would have been able to bring the IRA to the place it ended, and also to be so committed in such a transparent and such a very obvious way, such a convincing way as Martin McGuinness was to reconciliation. And I think that is going to be his legacy. I think certainly lives were taken when he was in the IRA, and he had a role in that. But I think there is a recognition in the Northern Ireland of today that in the past 10 years, lives have been saved and people have changed, and Martin McGuinness was at the forefront of that change.
And I suppose, David Avonpower, also what Tommy is saying underlines the fact that there's still a job of work to be done to try and get the institutions back up and running, the executive re-established in Northern Ireland, and to try to contain as far as possible the threat from dissident Republicans, and that will be a task now which will have to be faced without Martin McGuinness.
It will have to be faced without Martin McGuinness, and Martin McGuinness, the politician, has been a very important figure in Stormont, obviously throughout the Paisley years. It didn't go so well with Arlene Foster. Martin McGuinness has passed away now, so a whole new political dynamic, I think, will come to bear at Stormont. It remains to be seen how the negotiations aimed at restoring devolution go. But Martin McGuinness won't be part of the administration that is established, if it is established, at the end of the road there. So I think politics in Northern Ireland is going to be very different. It may well be that the torch is genuinely passing to a new generation of politicians that had no direct contact whatsoever with the Troubles, and that, in a sense, may be another element of significance about the sad passing of Mr. McGuinness. But his emollient skills obviously deserted him with Arlene Foster. He, in the end, had to throw up his hands and say, I can't make this work, leading to the collapse of the executive, as we know. Putting things together again, I don't know. Mr. McGuinness was a very skillful politician, a man who could get on with most people. I've no doubt that those qualities will be missed in the months ahead.
Right, David, thank you. Well, now, in a recent interview with RTE News, Martin McGuinness said he wasn't ashamed of his past, but was equally as proud of the role he played in the peace process. He told Tommy Gorman that he hoped he'd be remembered and judged fairly by people.
Well, I don't really care how history assesses me. Historians, many of them coming from different political perspectives, will do that, and I leave it to them, and I leave it to the judgment of people. But I'm very proud of where I've come from. I'm very proud that we have been through the celebrations, commemorations of the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. And my heroes were those people, and in every generation since, who have tried and struggled hard to bring about the reunification of this country. Obviously, we found ourselves in a situation in Derry in the early 1970s where the British Army and the RUC were on our streets murdering our citizens. I was amongst a group of many young people, supported by many thousands of people in the city who were prepared to stand against them. And I'm not ashamed of that. I think it was the right thing to do. But equally, I'm as proud of the role that I've played over, I suppose now, nearly 25 years in developing a peace process that has changed all of that. And I think when you consider the journey that has been made, I'm not worried about being judged in the round, but I suppose what anybody would be concerned about is that you be judged fairly. And sometimes people who make judgments about what happened in Derry in 1969, 1970, 1971, you know, have never even been near the place and don't understand what was happening in the city at the time. So I leave the historians.
Martin McGuinness, well, a final word with Tommy. Martin McGuinness telling you there a little while ago, Tommy, that he's not too bothered about the verdict of history, but how do you think will he be remembered in time to come, and how much will he be missed, particularly in the immediate period ahead?
Well, the final part of your question, Brian, I suppose it depends on whether people have the strength of character to follow on his example, to take his lead, and to build bridges and mend fences. I'll tell you a final anecdote which I think for me puts his life in context. It's quite right that it was his decision where he said enough is enough. It was his decision to withdraw support, to resign as Deputy First Minister, that brought down the administration. But in the middle of the election campaign, Arlene Foster was very conscious that he was ill. And Arlene Foster had word sent to him, passing on her best wishes to him and hoping that he would recover. But this was Arlene Foster, whose, I suppose, role he had taken away by collapsing the administration. And the final text on my phone that I have from Martin McGuinness was him asking that thanks would be passed on to Arlene Foster. So they were enemies towards the very end of his political career, but his final act, before he actually gave up using his phone and his wife Bernie took over the use of it because he was so weak, his final act, one of his final acts that I'm aware of, was that he was reconciled with Arlene Foster.
Okay, there we leave it. Tommy Gorman in Stormont, thank you indeed for that. Thanks also to David Devon-Power for being with us here in studio. That's all from this special news broadcast. Our next main bulletin on this channel will be at 1 o'clock, but from now, from all of us here, a very good morning to you.